All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone joining us today. And especially welcome to our IIASA Voices event. This marks the 11th installment in our ongoing series showcasing the valuable contributions of IIASA to the general public. And we're happy to present an outstanding lineup today. So first of all, IIASA conducts policy-oriented research, typically using systems analysis to address problems that are too large or too complex to be solved by a single country or academic discipline. Our research uses applied systems thinking to tackle the challenges facing our society, such as climate change, just societies, and natural resources management, to name just a few of them. They also partner together with scientists, governments, and local entities to create a broad understanding of problems that concern us all. They deliver important scientific information that is then used at different levels of government to make decisions on the future of our society. So we believe that this information should be available to all, and we're also interested in new perspectives, which is why we've launched this series. So it's a conversation with IIASA experts, which begins with some presentations and then is opened up to Q&A. We will send around also a short survey at the end of the event, and we'd be hugely grateful if you could take just a few moments to fill this in. My name is Alberto, and I joined the Equity and Justice Research Group of the IIASA Population and Just Societies program as a research assistant in October 2021. And I'm now a project manager for Horizon Europe research projects at UTIMA Research Services in Vienna. Whilst at IIASA, I worked on the topic of grey conventional infrastructure failure in comparison to nature-based solutions failure, with a special focus on flood and landslide infrastructure, examining and having a look at the barriers to the implementation of these public infrastructures at different stages. Firstly, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker and my colleague Juliette Martin. Juliette joined IIASA in 2018 and works as a research scholar in the Biodiversity, Ecology and Conservation Group and the Equity and Justice Research Groups. So she recently led tasks in the Physikos project, which aim to demonstrate how nature-based solutions provide robust, sustainable and cost-effective measures for reducing risk of extreme weather events in rural mountain areas. And Juliette also works in the interface between governance, conservation, and climate change. She also recently joined the Horizon Europe projects NatTrends and the HUT, where she leads work on the enablers and barriers of nature-based solutions. Juliette, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Alberto. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Right. Thank you. Thanks, Alberto. So my name is Juliette Martin, and the work that I'm presenting today is, of course, a big team effort. It's been part of several EU-funded projects, and the focus is nature-based solutions, but really the governance of nature-based solutions. So that will be the focus for today. Now, I know most of you will be familiar with nature-based solutions or NBS, but just as a refresher, because I know that listeners will be coming from very different backgrounds, and there are now many different definitions floating around on what nature-based solutions are. But the UNO 5 definition, which is quite recent, defines them as actions to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use or manage basically our natural environments, but importantly, they need to simultaneously provide human well-being benefits, ecosystem services, biodiversity benefits, and resilient benefits. So it is commonly understood now as an umbrella concept that does include other concepts like ecosystem-based approaches or eco-DR. But what I want to highlight here, and what I guess makes them so popular and so special, is the systemic way in which they can help us tackle several societal issues at the same time, particularly at the biodiversity and the climate nexus. And we have particularly worked in a disaster risk reduction context a lot. So why do we need them in the first place? And I do know that I'm probably preaching to the converted here to a large extent, but we are currently facing several existential threats at this point through global warming and biodiversity loss and all of the related impacts to that. And all of these are happening at a very alarming rate. So close to half of our ecosystems have already declined or deteriorated. 2023 looks like it's going to be the hottest year on record since the 1850s. So I think, needless to say, there is a really, really urgent need for action, and the window of opportunity to actually make a change is closing as well rapidly. And at the same time, of course, we do know that we depend on nature and functioning ecosystems for so many different things. And that does have really big repercussions on human well-being, but also our economy. And it was estimated that nature contributes to about half of our GDP. I think it's probably more than that. But this is where basically nature-based solutions come in. So they might not be entirely new in terms of the concept, but they are needed more than ever. And they could contribute to a very large chunk of our climate mitigation actions and to be able to reach the Paris Agreement goals, as well as our different biodiversity targets. So they do hold a huge amount of potential. And there has been a lot of work going on nature-based solutions. They are very popular, but there's been a lot done on the kind of technical aspects and how you design them, etc. And all of these things are very important. But what we find is that when environmental actions fail, this is often due to some underlying governance issues. So our work really focuses on that aspect, on the governance, where we see governance going beyond just government or policies. So really, when we talk about NBS governance, this includes how all of us, so different stakeholders, including authorities, market actors, politicians, funders, and just civil society as a whole, how we make decisions on nature-based solutions, how we collaborate and organize ourselves. So it does go beyond just policy. And specifically, there were two governance gaps that me and JoAnne wanted to address in this webinar today. The first one is what we call the NBS implementation gap, which is nothing else than the fact that right now we do have a lot of policies that address nature-based solutions, notably in the EU biodiversity strategy, the restoration law, but also beyond that, for example, the global biodiversity framework. So they are popping up everywhere on political agendas. But what we find is that that isn't followed by action on the ground. So the action on the ground is not matching that ambition. So that's why we called it an implementation gap. And the other gap, which will be addressed a little bit more by JoAnne, is the nature financing gap, which was identified by UNEP, which does basically say that we need to invest a lot more into nature if we want to reach our climate, biodiversity, and land degradation targets. So it was estimated that we need to double our investments in nature by 2025, which is around the corner. So we wanted to provide some answers to some of these gaps, why they exist and how we can begin to bridge them. And for that, we do need to gain some understanding on how or what is currently standing in the way of nature-based solutions. What are the barriers? So this is what we did then. So this is the result of a systematic review that looked at peer-reviewed literature, also workshop findings, interview results, and from there, I extracted different barriers that were mentioned in terms of the implementation of nature-based solutions. And then these were then clustered. So we came to around 260 barriers, and they were clustered into different themes. And this is what we found. And since I don't have time to go over each individual barrier cluster, I will just highlight the top 5 here, but the full version of this work has been shared, I think, now in the chat. So you can refer to that if you want to have the full picture. So the top 5 here were, well, the first one was lack of expertise and knowledge. So this was the most important barrier. And really what this involved was the absence of qualified firms that really are specialized on nature-based solutions. Because nature-based solutions bring together so many different disciplines, there's this element of novelty, but this cluster also included things like the lack of institutional experience, for example, and the lack of guidelines. The second most important barrier was the lack of evidence on performance and the co-benefits of nature-based solutions. So it's the fact that we lack long-term studies that look at co-benefits, the fact that it's really hard to quantify some of the nature-based solution co-benefits because they are, a lot of them, of public good nature or just not very tangible. But also uncertainty on the performance of nature-based solutions as compared to grey alternatives. The third most important barrier cluster here was really about stakeholder and equity conflicts. So this included the lack of inclusive stakeholder engagement or co-design, or when other fairness dimensions were neglected. So not just in the procedural justice, but also distributive justice, and also simply conflicts that can arise because different stakeholder groups either want different things out of a nature-based solution, or they don't want it at all. And then the fourth most important barrier was path dependency, which is the idea that we're a little bit stuck because of our current existing legal framework and decisions that were made in the past. And this is often the case in current policies that favor grey infrastructure still. And that makes it very hard to break away from that, basically. And the last, or the fifth most important barrier was the lack of funding and the complexity of funding. I think this is an obvious one for most people. Most IIASAs are still publicly funded. That means there's often very limited funds for them, or you rely on co-funding. But there's also the fact that often nature-based solutions are still perceived as just being more expensive, especially for their maintenance. But I won't cover this aspect too much because this is the topic that JoAnne will be covering in more depth. So I wanted to bring this a little bit into reality and also, to also move away from just literature. But here's an example from one of our projects called Fysikas that already ended. This was a case in Norway, in Jorikstad, where a receded flood barrier was proposed. It was going to allow for more space for flooding. And it was also going to involve some restoration of the floodplain and the riparian vegetation, but it didn't go through. And there were many reasons for them. They're listed here, but one of the key reasons, which I think is quite representative of probably a lot of nature-based solutions, was that basically with that new flood barrier, it would have decreased the gravel deposition. And the gravel was something that the landowners were harvesting and reselling. So they would have lost that source of income and it would have caused quite a lot of opposition. So yeah, I think that is quite representative of a lot of nature-based solutions and just conflicts. But also, there were other reasons. One of the key ones was also that the cost estimate initially was a lot lower than what it would actually have cost. But anyways, I think, there are many examples of failed nature-based solutions. And the issue is that often these aren't captured anywhere. Because, of course, literature tends to focus on successes rather than failures. And the next thing we wondered then was how different is this really from the challenges that grey infrastructure faces? Because we know that grey infrastructure also often fails. And we therefore wanted to do a bit of a comparative analysis between grey infrastructure barriers and nature-based solution barriers. And this is actually work led by Alberto. And our reasoning was that we have been doing grey infrastructure for a lot longer than nature-based solutions. So can we learn from how the challenges were overcome for grey infrastructure? And as we suspected, there were a lot of overlaps, as you can see. However, there were also some key differences. And this is what I wanted to highlight here, because those key differences or, key barriers that are different or higher for nature-based solutions really are the ones that are unique to them or more novel. So those are the ones that we need to focus our efforts on if we really want to change NBS governance. And those three were the lack of expertise and knowledge, the lack of evidence on performance and co-benefits, and the path dependency that I mentioned already. We did also want to ground this in reality, so not just looking at literature and what it says, but also doing interviews. So we did a more in-depth analysis of these three, let's call them blockers of nature-based solutions, with contractors, with designers, with local authorities in Norway, with our partners' help. And these are some quotes that came out of these interviews. So for example, on path dependency, you can see that the kind of recurrent idea is this is how we've always done it, and this is how we know how to do it. So this was highlighted many times in interviews. In terms of the lack of evidence on performance and co-benefits, this does also, of course, relate to path dependency. But here, the aspect that kind of comes up in these quotes is the aspect of risk. So it's the fact that if something goes wrong with a nature-based solution, who is liable, who is responsible, and basically we cannot take that risk. And of course, lack of expertise and knowledge here. The main point that was made was that municipalities already struggle, in general with limited funds, but then also they don't have the knowledge to just get a nature-based solution together. And of course, we couldn't just end here. And also a part of our work was, of course, to think about what we can do now that we know about all these barriers. And we did come up with some suggestions for policy reforms. Those were derived from, again, many different places, interviews. There was a series of policy business fora led by a colleague as well in Geneva. And of course, sometimes our own reflections. Again, won't cover all of those, but they are in the full resources that were shared. But I will walk you through 3 examples. So here our first suggestion was really about developing a robust knowledge base, because we know now that one of the biggest challenges for implementing nature-based solutions and justifying them over grey infrastructure is really a unique barrier. And really what we need to do here is to strengthen the evidence also on the evaluation of nature-based solution effectiveness, on their co-benefits, which could be achieved through formal standards. There is already the ICN standard, of course, but also specifically standards for insurance or liability-related standards and guidelines. Of course, also further tools need to be developed to be able to quantify and to compare the cost benefits between nature-based solutions and their alternatives. And of course, in a way, this is a vicious cycle, because we need more evidence on long-term benefits of nature-based solutions for them to be implemented and to justify them. But at the same time, without getting them implemented in the first place, we won't have that evidence. So either way, it is a bit of a catch-22 and it will take time. And this is where suggestion number 2 comes in, because right now the burden of proof lies on nature-based solutions. That's why the lack of evidence on co-benefits and performance is seen as such a big barrier. But if we switch that burden, this would mean that nature-based solutions are assumed to be the preferred option unless the grey solution is proven superior. And one way in which we thought this could be achieved is by expanding the EIA directive, by making nature-based solutions basically a compulsory element of any landscape planning, or also exempting certain nature-based solutions of EIAs. And I know that this has happened in Europe for certain renewable energy projects, for example, to avoid EIA procedures, so they're exempt of doing a full EIA. And in a similar way, we could also, for selected nature-based solutions, so probably those that don't have a very high mortality risk, they could be exempt as well, or subject to a streamlined process, and this could really help break this grey path dependency. And our third suggestion was really on updating and strengthening policies. And right now, most policies and strategies addressing nature-based solutions, and there are many of them, they still rely on voluntary action. And we argue that you do need some legally binding targets. Of course, this is now hopefully going to change with the restoration law, which was agreed upon a few weeks ago. But what could also really help here are simplified NBS approval procedures. So, for example, self-certification schemes, because we know that in many of the cases that we worked with, the administrative burden can be very off-putting for local authorities. And because of the multiple benefits and remits of nature-based solutions, also fostering policy synergies, like having joint climate and biodiversity plans, for example, that could be an important step. And it does go hand in hand also with just promoting cross-sectoral secretariats, for example, or cross-sectoral initiatives for nature-based solutions. So where do we go from here? It is a very fast evolving environment. Things are changing really fast right now. Among others, at least if you're from Europe, in Europe, the restoration law for restoring at least 20% of land and seas by 2030, those are very big steps forwards. And we do think that the interest in nature-based solution will keep increasing. So they will still be on political agendas very strongly and gain traction. I did want to add a pinch of salt to this, though, because I think that sometimes we run the risk of portraying NBSs as the silver bullets that can solve all of our issues. It can also open up the risk for greenwashing if we portray them as the solution to everything. What I think is that they do hold a lot of potential if we reshape the current nature-based solution governance models to address the different obstacles and barriers that we identified. We'll continue working on this. There's still a lot to learn, and things are evolving fast. However, there is an elephant in the room that I didn't address at length because it is something that will be covered in the next talk a little bit more. But that is funding, because of course you can have a very good stakeholder setup and co-design and whatever you want, but it probably won't matter if you don't have funding for or financing for the nature-based solution. So it is the elephant in the room, and it is arguably maybe a prerequisite and something that matters maybe even more than having, it probably won't matter if you have stakeholder conflict if you don't have funding, right? So JoAnne will address this in more depth. And I think that we have time for a few questions now, and then you can still ask questions about my talk afterwards, and we'll still have more questions after the first round. But thanks a lot for listening.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Juliette, for this magnificent presentation and talk. Very, very insightful. I say this not unbiased at all, haven't been part of the study. No, but we do have a few minutes for questions from the audience. So we may manage 2 to 3 questions. Let's see if they come in. I'll keep an eye on the Q&A section. In the meantime, while hopefully people start typing, wanting to know more from you from this very, very interesting and up-to-date topic, I'd have a question, and that would be, so do you have any examples, or are there any examples where some of the barriers you mentioned were overcome?
That's a good question. I think many, and of course, part of the work that I didn't present today was also to look at enablers, but it's kind of the counter side of barriers often. But many cases, one that comes to mind, which I think probably many will be familiar with, is the IIASA restoration, where what happened is, of course, as with many, so this was a flood protection project, or ended up being. So the main rationale was to reduce floods in Munich. And in the end, what happened is that many different sectors came together to create a working group that would discuss all the different stretches of the project and agree, basically bringing together ecologists, but also bringing together different scales, because the Bavaria state was involved, as well as the city of Munich. And this working group, I think, for me, has been one of the most successful or success examples, where really different sectors came together in a polycentric kind of arrangement, where they would agree and resolve conflicts, basically, by bringing together all their different expertise.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot. In the meantime, I might just quickly mention to the audience, in case they haven't had a look into the Q&A yet. So we had a brief question, and that was if the slides will be made available. Just a quick hint, they will be made available through the recording, so people will be able to go through everything, so slides and voice over talk. So that's very good. In that sense, I would actually have yet another question, and that actually concerns EU policies. So what EU policies do you see as the big game changers for NBS in the future?
I mean, I think, the fact that they have now popped up on so many, on the policy landscape in the EU, means that probably I can't have an exhaustive answer, but really, I mean, the restoration law that was now agreed on for the 20% a few weeks ago, for me, would be a bit of a game changer. And of course, also something that I didn't mention, but there is the EU taxonomy for sustainable activities, which will basically require all activities to prove that they are sustainable and prevent greenwashing. So I think that could also be a very important one.
All right, thanks a lot. We do have now one question from the audience, and that is, is there any progress of evidence of the co-benefits of NBS? Very interesting question.
and very much at the heart of the debate. So there are many studies actually being done on co-benefits. And at least I can say that in the Physikos project, definitely there was an entire work packet dedicated to that. I think a lot of European projects right now have at least, a work package or a task that is trying to do that. I think what we're missing sometimes is the quantification of let's say the intangible benefits. So things that contribute to human well-being, but that cannot be quantified in numbers. But even there are a lot of efforts also using other methods now to do that more qualitatively. But so, yeah, I do believe that there's a lot of work going on, and happy to share some resources on that as well.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. This would cover the questions from this session or your presentation now. At the end, there'll be another chance to have more questions. Thanks a lot, Juliette, also for the talk and answering the questions. And now I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker. So now I'd like to give the floor to our second speaker, JoAnne. JoAnne is a distinguished emeritus research scholar, also in the Equity and Justice Research Group. And her research focuses on global change, with a particular interest in the risk of extreme events, nature-based solutions for the mitigation, insurance for transferring risk, and participatory processes for inclusive stakeholder engagement. JoAnne and her colleagues have designed and tested novel stakeholder co-design techniques, as well as developed policy options to support risk reduction, risk transfer, and other forms of proactive disaster risk management. She has a special interest in financing and insurance instruments for equitably sharing risks and, importantly, enabling their reduction. Today, she's going to present ideas on how to finance and support nature-based solutions. JoAnne, the floor is yours. I think you're still muted. There we go.
All righty. I hope you can see this now.
Yep, we can see the slides and hear you well. Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
JoAnne.
Okay. Yeah, I'm JoAnne Linnerooth-Bayer, and I will be now doing part 2 of this presentation and focusing very much on the funding and financing gaps. And yes, indeed, there is an elephant in the room. And it is, of course, the nature-based solution funding gap. And turning back again to the UNEP report, quoting, climate, biodiversity, and land degradation goals will be out of reach unless investments into nature-based solutions quickly ramp up to 384 billion per year by 2025, more than double of the current 154 billion a year. So let me just begin by talking about how do we, in fact, finance nature-based solutions. And you can see that there's a whole spectrum here, from public to private to hybrid. And just to give you a few examples, not being at all exhaustive, public funding relies, of course, on taxes, but also, of course, on borrowing through bonds, very topical now, green and resilience bonds, sometimes supplemented by user fees. Examples, water tariffs, also easements, betterment levies, also supplemented often by philanthropic donations. They can be usually voluntary contributions, NGOs, industry, crowdfunding, private financing of nature-based solutions, generally through loans or equity finance, or simply through savings. And then, of course, there's hybrids, which depend very much on public grants, subsidies, things like carbon offtakes. So what does the big picture look like? What is the funding landscape? Well, if you look at this chart here, this graph, which mirrors very much what we have done, we've been looking at a database of projects, and here you see that the first 4 are all from public funding, and indeed, public funding dominates 80 to 90% of the financing for nature-based solutions. But, and here's the big but, our government budgets in the European Union are seriously strapped after the COVID, of course, and of course with austerity. We're not going to be able to just ramp this up. And other sources are small to negligible. So many commentaries have come in and said, well, it's obvious we need to ramp up private investments in nature-based solutions. And there's a great deal of optimism stemming from the private investments that we've seen into renewable energy technologies. But there's a big difference. NBSs are for the most part public goods, meaning that you can't exclude people from their benefits. And that means, of course, you can't price them and generate a revenue stream. So, it's hard to build a business model. What can be done? Well, according to a recent report by the European Investment Bank, we could have a change in market structures. I call this regulation, but to incentivize private entities, incentivize is always a popular word, incentivize private entities to deploy NBS or reduce their environmental impact. We could also require it, but okay. The development of private markets for public goods, such as extending carbon credit markets to cover biodiversity enhancement. And I know some of you might be throwing eggs at me for this. They're very controversial, but of course we have to acknowledge, but also address the significant challenges of carbon and now maybe biodiversity markets. Co or blended financing, for example, for nature-based enterprises. Oops, sorry. How that happened. Okay, what I haven't covered, let me go back. What I haven't covered here, this is mainly Main Street. We haven't covered Wall Street. And I'm very interested in how can financial institutions enable or fund nature-based solutions. That means banks, that means asset managers, and so on. And I will be looking now at the rest of this talk on one major financial institution, and that is insurance. So you're probably asking, oh dear, why insurance? What does that have to do with nature? Well, this is something we've been investigating in actually two EU projects, Naturance and Firelog. And I can say that insurance has a great deal to do with nature-based solutions. And to understand that, you have to understand that that insurance is actually two businesses. What we call one, the underwriting pillar, it's insurance, which is big. Worldwide annual premiums are well over 150 billion, about half of the aforementioned global nature-based solutions financing gap. And maybe even more importantly, insurance has a significant influence on our lives and the economy. And just think for a minute, what if insurers would collectively say, we're not going to insure any more drivers of fossil fuel cars? That gives you a sense of the potential of what, in fact, the power that insurers might have over our economies. Well, the underwriting pillar, it fuels the investment pillar, which is huge. The US insurance industry alone has 1.5 trillion in capital, making it one of the largest institutional investors. Shifting its investment portfolio towards a nature-based economy can have significant influence. So I'm going to now turn to what this all means by doing a bit of a deep dive into each of these pillars, and where I have here listed different activities under these pillars, and note that I have color-coded them. The greens are rather consistent with the insurance business model as it currently operates. The yellow could be consistent, but there's a big if. And the pinks, going on in some cases red, need a new business model. And here's an important point, which I hope maybe we could come back to in the discussion. What does it mean to need a new business model? Well, it could mean that it's quite difficult in the way our economies are structured today. Insurers operate in very competitive markets, and they do have a fiduciary responsibility to their clients. How far can they go? So let's start filling this out with a few examples. Insure natural capital. One, example, insuring coral reefs. In 2018, Swiss Re offered an innovative parametric insurance product to insure the Quintana Roo coral barrier reefs in Mexico against storm damage. According to Swiss Re, this is the first natural ecosystem to be insured. It's paid by municipalities, tourism business, and philanthropic sources. How it works, if there's a storm above a certain intensity, that triggers a payment, a quick payment that can go directly then to divers who then go down and actually can restore the reef, partly restore it, let's say. Let's go to de-risking nature-based solutions. The example I have here is de-risking mass timber. Constructing in wood can store huge amounts of carbon, as we're hearing now from our new IIASA director, John Schellenhuber. Yet one big roadblock is insuring buildings against fire. Indeed, insurance can be 7 to 10 times higher for wood than for concrete masonry buildings. 7 to 10 times more insurance means a true barrier. You don't build the building. And this relationship of insurers to fire, to understand their hesitancy, it goes way back. In 1888, the city of Sundsvall in Sweden, built of wood, burned to the ground. A group of reinsurers let Sweden's insurers know there was going to be a limit in the future on losses from wooden houses, and it was going to be low. Sweden began building with stone. So you can imagine, now you're asking insurers to insure wood buildings, huh? Well, however, the technology, now called mass timber, has changed with far lower risks. And indeed, it's starting to change. Zurich, North America, with Lloyd's, has recently launched a new and affordable mass timber product. Okay, last green one here, enable NBS financing. And for that, I go to Belize, their blue bond. And the Nature Conservancy converted Belize's debt to a blue bond with the condition that Belize protects 30% of its ocean and allocates $180 million towards conservation. It's a big condition. This was a very complicated enterprise, putting this together. And it was only possible with insurance. Insuring against the political risk, which was done by the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, insuring against hurricane risk, done by WTW, i.e. Willis, and Munich Re. And this deal here very much illustrates what was so succinctly said by the CEO of IIASA, and that is, without insurance, there is no financing. Think of it. Okay, now I'm at this yellow. Incentivize NBS. I don't have an example because there hasn't been any, but I do want to make an important comment that actually outside even of NBS, there's few examples of insurance, of insurers incentivizing disaster risk reduction, for example, through premium discounts. But there is an exception. The exception is when risk becomes so high that clients can't pay the premiums. And that's called uninsurability. And we might want to come back to that in the discussion. But let's go to decline cover for nature negative projects. There's also very little on this, but one almost case was property insurers threatened to pull out of California given the high wildfire risk. They did that because they thought it was becoming uninsurable, but it was coming uninsurable because regulators were not letting them raise premiums based on climate change. But think about this. Since insurance is required for a mortgage, insurers pull out. This could greatly discourage building in high-risk areas, which of course could open up a lot of territory for rewilding and nature-based solutions. Now, if you move to the climate area, there is some precedent of insurers pulling out of projects. And for example, there are now pending court cases against insurers for underwriting the East African crude oil pipeline. So I've given you a few innovative cases. What does the whole big picture look like? Well, maybe this quote from McKinsey is kind of right on. It says, while many insurers have begun to incorporate climate risk considerations in their investment processes, and we'll turn to investment for this, but this is important, new product launches and underwriting processes are mostly unchanged. We have a long way to go, if we go at all. So let's go to the investment pillar. Why would insurers be at all interested in changing their big, large portfolios to invest more in nature positive? Well, the strong motivation is that nature is increasingly viewed, qualify that, it's increasingly viewed in boardrooms as essential for insurers' long-term viability, what insurers call financial materiality. And I repeat what Juliette already reminded us of. Over half of global GDP depends on nature and the services it provides. Biodiversity loss could lead between 1.7 trillion and 3.9 trillion losses each year. Insurers are very aware of that, and they know how that would affect their portfolios. So what are they doing on the ground? Well, I think quite a lot in this ESG context and philanthropy, maybe not so much otherwise. So what about ESG? Well, let me give you this one example from Aviva, which claims to be the first major insurer worldwide to target net zero carbon by 2040. And it has donated £38 million to help wildlife trusts to restore Britain's biodiverse rainforests. Now, of course, 38 million to Aviva is peanuts. But every drop counts, and it sends a good signal. So what about insurers actually investing in nature-based solutions? And there's a lot of hype here. I come out also of the climate community, and particularly in climate adaptation. There's a lot of talk of, insurers will want to invest in things like mangrove forests because that will reduce flood losses. And of course, they're interested in reducing flood losses because they insure them. And that's what I call the great insurer's misnomer. In fact, insurers, and I argue, are reluctant to invest in NBS if it's a public good, like mangrove forests, because one, it presents a free rider problem. Competitors can come in, take advantage of their investment and underprice them. Yeah. And if they're forced to reduce premiums, also from competitors and regulators, well, then they'll lose the return on investment that they've put into this. And indeed, there is little precedent for insurers investing in disaster risk reduction, period, overall. Okay, last here, but not least, in fact, not at all least, I think this could be the most powerful thing, is that insurers could pull some of their big investment portfolios out of nature negative divestment. We haven't seen that happen yet. Insurers say it's too early because they don't even have a clear idea of what is a nature negative asset. And the EU is addressing this quite aggressively. And the recent EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy provides a science-based classification system to assess financial decisions regarding contribution to environmental objectives. It's still voluntary. Okay, I'm going to end now. With closing the funding gap, some ideas. I don't have the solution. There's no silver bullet, and nobody does. So let's just put some ideas on the table that we can discuss. One, we can increase public budgets. This is being discussed a lot in member states for lots of reasons, not for nature usually, but through maybe property taxes, inheritance tax, wealth taxes, carbon taxes, nature negative taxes. Or we could independently fund NBS financing institutions, increase private investment. As I said again, I'll say it again, regulation. What if we make the taxonomy and those identified nature negative investments, what if we make it mandatory that they pull out of them? Yeah, not impossible. Subsidies, of course, grants, blended financing, and that controversial word offsets. Transform insurance and other financial institutions, more transparency in investment portfolios, that's happening. Here's one, disallow underwriting and or require divestment for select nature negative activities. I already mentioned that. And we might even think, if private insurers aren't going to do it, what about public insurers? So with that, I close and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, JoAnne, for this very interesting, insightful, and let's say, real world talk, very inspiring. We do have, if I may now go into the Q&A, we have a few questions, and I'd like to maybe start with the ones that are related to your talk, and then I'd go back to others that are maybe more general or more specific. But JoAnne, if I may read out to you the first question we have, which is quite interesting, and it concerns financing mechanisms. So it's by Cornelius Krüger, and the question is, do you consider debt for nature swaps a reasonable addition to the financing toolbox for NBSs?
I think we need all the tools we can get. I know there's lots of problems with nature swaps, just as there's problems with offsets and so on, and really saying, what is a legitimate one? Who's going to monitor it? How does it work in the future? I should say that at least with offsets, there is, and I didn't present that, but there are insurers who are coming in to provide, insurance if they don't work, so that, I guess, get your money back and invest somewhere else. So now, I don't think I've completely answered your question, because I admit I'm not an expert on nature swaps, but that's probably about as much as I can say. But Juliette, do you want to say something on that?
On the debt for nature swaps? No, no, that's all yours.
Okay.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks a lot. Maybe I move on to the next question, which is also related to your talk, JoAnne. So it is the following. Do you have an idea how responsive the insurance industry or partners are to more green finance? And is it becoming more topical or still on the periphery?
Of more green finance.
Exactly. So do you have an idea of how responsive the insurance industry and partners are to more green finance?
Yeah, I think some of the examples I went through was to really make that finance available. Take the police bond. That was making a huge amount, taking police's debt and really putting it into conservation. Yeah, and making all those arrangements. And insurers, are very keen on supporting those kinds of transactions. I think we could go through lots of examples. They're interested in it as long as they can make money on it. And of course, the insurers coming in doesn't provide more funding certainly for police's conservation, but indeed, they get paid for doing that, so there's actually less funding, but they do provide a really valuable service. It couldn't happen without them. And I think, in that sense, insurers are very interested in kind of continuing with their business model and making sure they facilitate green financing. So in that sense, very open to green financing.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot. Then just also in terms of also for time management and the sake of time and so on, I'd have two more questions, JoAnne, that are related to your talk that maybe we can tackle. And then we could tackle a few questions that came in earlier that are more general, and also one for your talk, Juliette, and also a note for the audience. So we're happy to respond any questions also via email afterwards. So anything that we don't get to now will be happily answered afterwards. And also a quick comment for viewers on YouTube. Feel free to ask also questions in the chat. It is linked, and those will be answered here in the plenary or afterwards by email. So JoAnne, the second last question directly for you. So is talking about the financial value in the concept of ecosystem services a good strategy to convince a stakeholder?
This one I might pass over to Juliette. I think, to talk about monetarizing nature is music to ears to people like me, economists, who like to think in terms of, well, let's put it where people will put their money. I know it's kind of the devil in disguise to a lot of people who see this more of a moral issue. We need to invest in nature, and let's not monetize it. That kind of dilutes it and dilutes its importance. So that's my take on it. But I know Juliette's thought a lot about ecosystem services, so maybe I turn it over to her.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because I really think, as JoAnne said, it really depends who you ask. And it does sometimes also come down to just, your worldviews basically and how you see nature. I have found that when I speak to stakeholders about ecosystem services, the responses are very mixed. So some people are very opposed to the idea of even, putting any sort of valuation on nature, and even the term ecosystem services, the sense that nature provides us with services or should provide us with anything really, can cause some opposition. So I think it really depends. I do think though that ecosystem services are broader than just putting value of a monetary value on nature. I think sometimes we tend to forget that ecosystem services, the initial concept was also about really trying to put some words on things that are more intrinsic values, or that don't have necessarily a monetary value, but we just sometimes with other valuation methods try to understand why people value nature or cultural values, heritage, etc. So I don't think it necessarily comes down to money and portraying ecosystem services as just putting money on nature. For me also rubs me the wrong way. But there is the whole aspect of also qualitatively trying to put words on that.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. Then I think we can jump back to some questions that concern, I think, the whole format. And so one of them is the evidence base for NBS needs to get out of academia and policy into the hands of the working community that can put NBS into practice, for example, via professional bodies, health, planning, architecture, and so on. Is this happening? Who wants to go first?
Juliette, I think that's kind of in your territory with all the interviews that were done with contractors and architects and so.
Yeah. I mean, and that's what I was thinking about as well. So I completely agree. If it remains an academic exercise, there is little value to the more applied issues, which is why, of course, we didn't just stay at looking at literature, talking to experts. I think in a lot of projects, including ours, and we were very lucky with that, there is actual on-the-ground implementation. So at least in some of our projects, there's actual nature-based solutions that are implemented. So you bring in reality because you have to talk to professional bodies or planning firms or landscape architects. And that's why we also, a part of the analysis that we did was doing interviews with contractors, with basically nature-based enterprises that would be the ones either designing a nature-based solution or constructing it, for example, construction firms. So is this happening? Probably not enough. And I think this is what our interviews are showing, that there is sometimes a little bit of a disconnect between, let's say, the experts that look at the science, etc., and communicating that. But I do think that there's a lot of efforts ongoing to change that, to disseminate results. I know we're trying to do that. And to really, bridge the gap between science and policy and those who are actually on the ground implementing things and understanding what their challenges are and what their needs are and how science can help, basically. JoAnne.
I could just add a little to that. Juliette said, I mean, when you go in and really talk to the architects and to the contractors, and so first they say, we're not going to do it unless there's some funding and, there's some seriousness. They get contracted to do this. So, the municipalities, usually the contractor, needs to be funded. But the second thing is that is particularly in the disaster reduction area, where you're using a nature-based solution, maybe to stop landslides or so. They're very concerned about liability. What if we put this in and it doesn't work? Maybe landslide comes down, kills a few people, who's liable? And they're very concerned about the that there's not this, they can't fall back and say, well, we followed all the standards, all the guidelines, which they can if it's a concrete structure. So they're taking a risk, so that has to be sorted out. And in addition, they also have a real deficit in expertise. They say, well, we can't hire people who know this. So I think all the points that Juliette hit on expertise, on guidelines, on rules. It really comes home when you talk to these people, because they say, we're not sure we're going to take those contracts.
Thanks a lot. I think now we have two questions in the chat that I think might kind of fit into this, or are very much interlinked. So one of them was placed earlier, and it was asking generally on what are some of the priority factors for achieving good success in NBS? And I think now with your answers, we're trying kind of getting in there and trying to answer that. But that could be maybe one thing that you could mention at the end, because in the meantime, we got another question, and that is by Judith Stemmerding-Carrot. And the question is, how do you consider enhancing not only knowledge about NBS, but also personal attitudes and skills to be able of generative listening and maybe also deeper systemic understanding to get real cooperation and support of NBS? So, moving from what we just answered to this question then to what's the priority for achieving success?
Really, why don't you take that one?
Juliette.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were saying you're taking that one. I think both of us probably have things to say about that. No, I think this is a key point. And in fact, this whole skepticism surrounding nature-based solutions, and just the awareness of it and what they can do and whether they really are, better or even safe. That's a very important factor. So I think, at least in some of our projects, the whole co-design aspect has been very important. I think JoAnne can tell you a lot more about that, because they actually did a true co-design in a case. But I think in many cases, what you try to do is, we had something called living labs, which are basically a way of involving stakeholders throughout the entire lifetime of a nature-based solution. We have done some evaluation of that within the project, and I think it goes to show that involving stakeholders at all the stages has led to some high awareness. It's very hard to quantify that, is also what we concluded. But I do think that something around the learning and the deep learning is something that needs to be considered also going forward in future projects, and is sometimes also neglected, or you don't think about it in the beginning. But having a robust way of really evaluating that change in attitude and the skills and the deep systemic understanding, that's something that's really important.
Yeah,
JoAnne, you probably want to add.
Yeah, you mentioned our co-design process, and I think it isn't just a matter of, you have this bunch of people and they all need to know about nature-based solutions and then they're all on board. There is really this, and I think every other policy environment I've been involved in, there is really a worldview battle that goes on. So in our group in the co-design, there was a group who really wanted to see a nature-based solution for landslide risk. There was another group who didn't want it at all. And there was no way we were going to change that. In the end, we're going to have to work a compromise. This went over 3 years. This was not something you do in an afternoon. And in the end, it turned out to be hybrid. And one thing that we kind of concluded for this long process, and also other case studies we've done, that when you throw this out into the political process with all the stakeholders, you're likely going to end up with hybrid solutions. That's the reality. And I think another point on that is what we're saying about changing the burden of proof. If in fact, you go in and you say, okay, we're going to build this concrete wall, it's safe. But what if you said, okay, but you're going to have to show us that that doesn't have any negative effects on the environment? And if you can't show that, the default will be the nature-based solution. And yes, we don't have enough evidence. We won't have enough evidence probably for 30 years till we really can build a database, but we don't have 30 years. You saw from the beginning, our first slides, we got to double nature-based solutions in 2 years, till 2025, till 3 years, 2 years. This is urgent. Yes, if we had all the time in the world, we could say, let's collect all the evidence we need. Let's make a really great case that, that we lower the probability to this, fine, we don't have it. So, we're going to have to go ahead, frankly, accepting some risk. We need to talk about how we're going to secure that risk, for example, with insurance systems, maybe public systems, to make sure we take this risk out of individual hands, maybe put it in the public sector, because the agenda is so urgent and so important.
Wow. Brilliant. Thank you very much, JoAnne, and thank you very much, Juliette, for answering the questions. We are nearing the end of our session, so all of the remaining questions will be happily answered afterwards by email. Due to your registration for this event, we can keep in touch. So that's something JoAnne and Juliette will happily do, hopefully. Thanks. With that, let me thank everyone. Thank you for your presence here today. As we mentioned earlier, a recording of this webinar is going to be accessible at the IIASA website and on the YouTube channel. And we'll also provide links to all the resources mentioned during the presentation. We trust you found the discussions engaging and informative. I believe so, seeing the many questions we have in the chat. And also, again, all questions submitted are very much appreciated, and we really make an effort to address most of them. Again, your kind feedback is invaluable for enhancing future events of this series. So we'd be grateful if you could kindly take a moment to participate then in the post-meeting survey that's going to appear on your browser after you exit the session. And then also rest assured that the responses are will remain anonymous, and the insights gathered will guide our continuous improvement efforts for upcoming events and will be managed by our colleagues at the ERCL department only. With that, this was actually, it ended, it's ending. This was the last webinar for 2023. And I'd like to thank all speakers again that they took part. We look forward to welcoming you back at our next IIASA webinar on a very interesting topic, migration, from our same research program in January 2024. And for updates, please follow us on our social media channels. Thanks also to the whole team in the background organizing this. And have a wonderful day. See you soon.